Good morning. So it's a bit emotional to talk on that conference. Okay. As it has been said many times already, Krzysztof did touch a lot of subjects. He was quite versatile in the subject he was working on. And so I will discuss a bit all the detour he made in mathematical physics. As Antti said, in the 19th, he was working on conformal field theory, in connection with Church-Simon theory, and other aspects related to geometrical construction, related to conformal field theory. Then he moved to use of jabs and their application, also in conformal field theory. And then in different topics that we discuss more related to out of equilibrium physics, either classical or quantum, or topological matters. But before doing that, I would like to show you, so there is light, it's a bit, few unwritten notes by Krzysztof. That's were notes that we were exchanging when we were working on passive scalar turbulence in the late 90s. I think this one was related to Berger, this one to the passive scalars. And as it has been said, Krzysztof knew a lot of things on many topics. He was knowledgeable in many topics and was always trying to share all his knowledge. Sometimes he was very rigorous, very precise when he was explaining things. One of the main comments when we were working together and when it was not working, he was always repeating, try harder, many times, which when you work with him, you're not so easy with that sentence when Krzysztof was telling you that you have to work harder. Then I became more relaxed with that sentence when I learned that actually somebody tell him that's on him. And that's what he was repeating it, so he was just doing it. Okay, so I learned a lot about these things, and I joined a collaboration with Antti after they understood the zero mode. So we did understood the role of concept structure altogether. And another piece of notes by him. So that's related to, again, probably passive scalar, and that's related to the inverse normalization group applied to turbulence. I'm not sure he never published something, but that's an example where he had many private notes that he was sharing with everybody. He liked to explain and to teach and to propagate his knowledge in the community. He wrote many lectures that he published also on different topics. So I think he was a nice teacher and a nice person to work with because how generous he was in sharing his knowledge. And as I said, but at the same time, very demanding. So when you were working with him, you you had to be serious a bit in a way. So as you can see, he has a very nice handwriting. So he was always using a pencil to work with and playing with his pencil, but a nice handwriting. So let me now go through the different subjects I want to cover. So the first one is on conformal field theory in the 19th. I think this was the time I met him. I was a student in a bizarre lab, but I was going to EHS time to time in that period. So I choose to select a few articles that I got on pass and a picture of his collaborators. So I apologize if I forget some picture. So I think the first paper he wrote on conformal field theory is related to the spectra of the Zimino-Witten model on Cooper groups. And that's a paper he did with Giovanni and Antti in the beginning of 90s. They were all three at IHS at that time. They had a bit of original approach because at that time, most of the approach to conformal field theory at that time was based on algebra construction, and they used something which, in a way, was probably inspired by what he was doing during his PhD on geometric quantization. That let them access to the spectra of the Weisumino-Witten model, which at that time were actually found by different means, imposing a modular invariance, but just by the approach which was showing that, which was imposing constraints in order to have a constant quantization, this constraint was selecting the spectrum, and in particular, it gave an explanation of what was called the non-diagonal modular invariant in terms of spectrum on non-simply connected groups. Another important paper on conformal theory that Krzysztof wrote together with Antti is related to the coset construction. So coset construction is the famous construction in conformal theory, which starting from Weisumino-Witten model, you can construct a large family of other conformal theory. That was at that time again done using a geometrical construction, which is called the Godard-Olive construction. But they have a different approach based on functional integral representation of the Weisumino-Witten model and of the fact that you have to coset it. Krzysztof was very at ease with a path integral and manipulation in path integral, and that's how they did it. I think this is the most quoted paper by Krzysztof. I'm not sure, but I think. And then another, I think, important series of papers or lecture notes are those given by Krzysztof. So he gives lecture, I think, for mathematicians at Princeton. He was going there time to time in Princeton. I think this started his work in Princeton with Antti. That's the first time where, no, not the first time I met Antti. So he was giving lecture for mathematicians, lecture on conformal theory for mathematicians. He gave lectures on, I think, on Bourbaki group also. And I think this is the beginning, maybe, of the unpublished book that Thierry Doxford mentioned. And I was in a conference on conformal theory recently with mathematicians, and now they call that one approach to conformal theory is based on Gawedzki axioms. And I think these Gawedzki axioms emerged from this lecture series that Krzysztof gave for mathematicians. So I think, as Antti says, this work which dates from the late 19th, and they are still very, takes time for people to absorb what Krzysztof was writing and saying, and then Krzysztof's work has echo 10, 20, or more, or 40 years later after they were endorsed by Krzysztof. And then a bit later in the 19th, so as Antti said, he started working on turbulence and passive scalar in the mid-19th, but at the same time he was still working, at the beginning, still working on conformal field theory, but he moved to conformal field theory in higher genus in connection with string perturbation theory, and in particular also in connecting conformal field theory and Chern-Simons theory. So there is a series of work with Fernando Falsetto, who is here, on Chern-Simons theory on higher genus, on genus 1 or higher. So when you, so the wave function, such as you can quantize Chern-Simons theory, and you look at the states of the Chern-Simons theory. These states, there is a gauge invariant, so they have to satisfy some Gauss law, and the Gauss law corresponds to impose the wide identities. So there is connection between these states and the conformal block in conformal field theory. So studying Chern-Simons on higher genus is a way also to get information on conformal field theory on higher genus. And one of the things they did is that they compute the scalar product between the stated conformal field theory, that's the Chern-Simons theory in higher genus, and that's a way to get access on partition function on Weisumino-Witten model on higher genus. So that's a nice series of work. At that time, there was Pascal Tran-Knott-Bick was student of Krzysztof. That's the person who went to METIC after his work. So I think he's not here today, but will be here tomorrow. Okay. And also they developed by looking at consistency conditions for conformal field theory on higher genus. They make connection between equations which govern conformal field theory of the Zumino-Witten model on higher genus on so-called Itchin system, and I think they were one of the rare group trying to develop that, and I am a bit attached to that because I have personal connection with this equation. So then he moved to Lyon. So before he was at IHS since when he arrived in France in the beginning of 80s, and he moved to Lyon in the beginning of 2000. He was still working parallelly at the same time in turbulence, as Antti said, but in parallel he was still working on conformal field theory, but at that time the focus of conformal field theory was more on property related to boundary conformal field theory in order to define branes who have impact in string theory. So Krzysztof was working on Zumino-Witten on companion model in surfaces with boundaries. And he was the person who understands that to properly define this theory on higher genus with boundary, you have to consider gerbs, which are geometrical structure, higher structures and vector bundles. And he wrote a series of papers on explaining how to use gerbs to define this model with boundary, and this led him to some classification of the possible branes related to the Zumino-Witten models. We'll see that so Krzysztof likes this kind of geometrical construction. So he likes path integral, but he likes also all this geometrical construction, in particular those related to vector bundles, gerbs, and so on. So, and he will use this construction in a totally different topics a few years later. Then I think there has been quite an abrupt change in the kind of mathematical physics he was doing. He moved more towards statistical physics. This was influenced by what he did on turbulence. So turbulence is a system out of equilibrium, so then he moved more to at least part of his activity was on out of equilibrium systems. And so in the 2000 or a bit more, 2010, then he worked on classical out of equilibrium system, but not in turbulence. At that time, Raphael was a student of him here in Lyon. So what they did together is look at fluctuation relation, which are extension of the fluctuation dissipation relation in stochastic processes, and they understand better the role of time inversal symmetry in such that these relations are echo of time reversal symmetry in a general sense. So that's two nice papers by them that probably Raphael will discuss a bit. At the time, so as you can see, he had many collaborators on that topics. And in particular, he has been working with Silvio Siliberto, and he contributed to an experimental paper on checking fluctuation relation, and probably this is the only experimental paper that Krzysztof co-signed, I believe. So I think it's quite remarkable that to be able to move from rigorous construction of quantum or statistical field theory to algebraic construction or geometrical construction related to conformal field theory, and then stochastic processes, which are quite different topics. Then, as it has been mentioned by Thierry, Krzysztof worked on topological matter, which are at equilibrium. And he was still in Lyon at that period. And I think this is the fact that he started working on that shows the influence he has on the group of theoretical physicists here in Lyon. So there was a few young researchers at that time in Lyon. In particular, David was here. I was not there, but they probably had many discussions. And this is how Krzysztof started working on a subject which was totally different for him compared to what he was doing before, but he was open enough to collaborate with them. So they work on topological matter, which was a new subject at that time. And interestingly enough, Krzysztof was able to understand the connection between his previous work on conformal field theory, in particular in the use of gerbs there, to give new construction of the Kane-Melle index theorem, which was used in topological matter. So I think it's quite remarkable, again, to be able to transfer from one knowledge, from one topic to another one, and to have the flexible enough mind to see the connection between the different subjects. So at that time, Clément was a student here. They work also, so they work on topological matter. So I didn't put a paper by him, but there is many. They work also on conformal field theory out of equilibrium, which is the subject that Krzysztof started to look at after that period. And here are the three last papers that are by Krzysztof on archive. They are on non-equilibrium system again, but for quantum system, for quantum many-body system, actually quantum critical system. So it's a way connecting what he did in the 90s of conformal field theory with what he did later on out-of-equilibrium system by mixing the two and studying critical and hence many-body system described by conformal field theory out of equilibrium. In particular, it shows how conformal field theory gives you a tool to describe such a system during the transient period before you reach the steady state, where you have a non-equilibrium steady state, so not Gibbs, but describing a flux out of equilibrium. So that is related to some work that Benjamin Doyon was doing at that time, and he will probably explain it. So as I said, these are the three last articles where he, besides using conformal field theory to describe this torsion period, they compute also full quantic statistic, which is a large deviation function for the transfer of charge in such a system, using tool from conformal field theory. But I am sure that he was working on different subjects. I remember discussing with him system related to open quantum system out of equilibrium or to Landau principle at that time. So he was also interested in other topics. I didn't find any papers by him, so I'm sure that he had notes that he showed me. So this shows again that he had many more notes, unpublished notes, written or typed in the second period of his career on different topics that he was sharing with everybody, but not always publishing. So he had a huge, I think, influence on many of us, I believe. We learned a lot from him, and for that, I think we should, I would like to thank him a lot. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you, Antti and Denis, for these nice overviews of Krzysztof's work. Now we're going to have questions, first in the room and then also on Zoom if there are any. So please, who would like to ask questions here? Over there is a question. Jörg?
I imagine that Gawedzki axioms are the Gawedzki axioms.
That was a misprint, yes.
Yes.
Sure. But I say axioms.
Good.
Another question? I would have a question for Antti. You mentioned this phase transition between different cascades. What was that parameter C, which rules the transition?
Yeah, if you look at the velocity covariance, so the original model was incompressible, so you take velocities where divergence is 0, but now you modify the covariance by adding a little bit of compressibility, namely that there is sources. And when you vary the coefficient of that compressible. So when C is 0, it's incompressible. When it's 1, it's fully compressible. And then there is a critical point in between. So that's the parameter.
Yeah, I have a little question for Denis. In the note that you show on the 0 mode, it was written homogeneous polynomial. And my question, I never understood if it must be polynomial or can be just asymptotic homogeneous function, the 0 mode.
But so we were computing perturbatively this 0 mode, so that was a parameter. So they were not polynomial, actually. They were polynomial plus times a log, and the log is because you're breaking the scaling invariant. So it's the first expansion. The log term represents the first expression in anomalous exponent. So that's a closed form. It's just polynomial times a log. Actually, the way it was working at the time that we found an ansatz for the 0 mode, which satisfies the condition we want. I don't think that for the endpoint function we had a theorem saying that all the 0 modes are of this form. That's the one you are interested in. But
I had a question to Antti. Antti, you mentioned that you have the paper of Krzysztof of the end of the 80s that I didn't remember, where, if I read you correctly, you said that it showed that the fusion rules came as a convergence condition on a certain integral. Can you say a little more?
Can you repeat again? So I didn't.
I think if I read you correctly, you mentioned a paper that I didn't remember of Krzysztof at the end of the 80s, where he showed that the fusion rules appear as a convergence condition on a certain integral. Can you say a little more on that?
Did I say something like that?
That was the abstract.
fusion
That was an abstract that you showed. Okay, if you don't remember, never mind. I'll take a look at the paper.
Let me try to think what you are talking about. So I'm not sure I mentioned it. Maybe it was Denis who mentioned it. But fusion rules in the Vesumida-Witten one. You are responsible for this.
I think when Giovanni, Antti, and Krzysztof studied the Vesumino-Witten model, you know that by doing geometric quantization in a way on looking at the states, quantum states describing the Vesumino-Witten model, they find the spectrum of characters which appears in the partition function for that model. And the way they select the representation is by imposing appropriate condition on the states. So they had to satisfy some their behavior for some value of parameters has to be regular enough or something like that. But this gives information on the representation which appears in the partition function, not directly on the fusion rules.
It's the scalar product. Once you look at the scalar product of the conformal, so the wave functions, the finiteness, demanding that to be finite puts your constraints. It was never proven actually that it.
Yeah.
It was never. Well, Fernando is the expert.
Yeah, actually, we were working on that with Krzysztof. Yes, that was in the scalar product for Chern-Simons states in the torus. Then, supposedly, I mean, as Antti says, we couldn't prove it. But, I mean, every check was done in the sense that conformal blocks would be those that have finite scalar product in this scalar product in the torus. So you have a kernel, and then the condition for the wave functions to have a scalar product are precisely those of being conformal blocks with the internal representations in the how's it? Okay, conformal blocks.
I have a question to Antti concerning the construction of the Grosvenor model. So what did it mean to construct it? Did you check some axioms, I don't know, Weidmann axioms or whatever?
You could have done that, yes. We didn't do that. We just constructed the correlation, continual limit of the correlation functions and proved that they become Gaussian in the short distances. But of course, another long paper would have accomplished all the axioms. Yes.
So it would have been easy or possible? Or
Yeah, it was even, I gave it as a PhD project to a student who vanished with the project. More or less, that's the history of the subject. But there you can do this quite nicely because everything is in terms of convergent expansion, so it's not as horrible as in the scalar theories.